Chapter 1, The Archive. The basement of the Federal Records Center in College Park, Maryland, smelled like old paper and broken promises. Dr. Sarah Chen had grown accustomed to it over her 3 years working there, that peculiar mixture of decaying pulp, industrial air conditioning, and something else she could never quite identify. Regret, maybe. Or secrets kept too long. She pushed her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose and squinted at the inventory list on her tablet. Row 47C, boxes 2891 through 2903. Another day, another dozen cartons of bureaucratic detritus from the 1970s that needed cataloging before they could be digitized or, more likely, transferred to permanent cold storage in some facility even more remote than this one. It was Thursday, November 3rd. Sarah remembered the date later, when it mattered. When people asked her to recount every detail. She remembered that her coffee had gone cold 2 hours earlier, sitting forgotten on the metal cart beside her laptop. She remembered the fluorescent lights humming overhead, one of them flickering in that irregular pattern that had been driving her slowly insane for weeks. She remembered thinking about her daughter's parent-teacher conference that evening, hoping she wouldn't be late again. She didn't remember, not at first, exactly what made her pause when she opened box 2897. The carton was standard issue, brown cardboard, reinforced corners, a faded reference number stenciled on the side in black ink that had turned rust-colored with age. According to the preliminary manifest, it should have contained routine correspondence from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, dated 1973 to 1974. Memos about budget allocations. Staffing reports. The mundane machinery of government grinding forward, one typewritten page at a time. But the weight was wrong. Sarah had handled enough of these boxes to develop an instinct for it. Paper had a certain heft, a certain way of settling. This box was too heavy, the contents too densely packed. She cut the seal with her box cutter, carefully, always carefully, because damaged documents meant paperwork and explanations, and folded back the flaps. Manila folders, as expected. Dozens of them, arranged vertically, packed tight. But underneath, wedged along the bottom of the box, was something else. A smaller container, maybe 10 inches by 12, wrapped in what looked like a black plastic trash bag and secured with packing tape that had yellowed and partially crystallized with age. Sarah glanced over her shoulder. The archive floor stretched out behind her, row upon row of shelving disappearing into the fluorescent distance. Marcus, the only other archivist working the late shift, was somewhere in the 60s section, probably listening to a podcast through his earbuds. The security camera in the corner pointed toward the main aisle, not at her specific workstation. Not that it mattered. She wasn't doing anything wrong. This was her job, to open boxes, examine contents, verify against manifests, note discrepancies. She pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves and carefully extracted the wrapped package. It was heavier than it looked, and something shifted inside as she set it on the cart. The plastic was brittle, cracking slightly at her touch. Through a small tear, she could see the edge of what appeared to be a leather-bound notebook or ledger. Sarah's pulse quickened slightly. This was unusual. Not unprecedented, she'd found misplaced items before, things that had gotten mixed in with the wrong materials during some long-ago transfer or reorganization. But something about this felt deliberate. Hidden, not lost. She carefully peeled away the plastic, taking photos with her tablet as she went, documenting each step. Standard procedure. The wrapping came away in pieces, releasing a smell of old leather and something chemical she couldn't identify. Beneath the outer layer was another wrapping, this one of oiled paper, the kind used to protect documents from moisture. And beneath that, finally, a journal. The cover was dark brown leather, cracked and dry. No title, no label. Sarah opened it carefully, supporting the spine, mindful of the brittleness of aged paper. The first page was handwritten in blue ink, the script precise and methodical. Project Hemisphere, Director's Log. Dr. Marcus Reeves. Initiated, March 1971. Classification, Eyes Only. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. She turned the page. March 15, 1971. We received final approval today. 5 years of proposals, presentations, justifications, and finally, someone high enough in the chain saw the necessity of what we're proposing. The potential. Jennings called it, innovative but aggressive. That's diplomatic language for what we both know it really is. But these are aggressive times. The unrest on college campuses, the protests, the breakdown of civic order, someone has to find solutions. Someone has to be willing to do what's necessary. We start with 30 subjects. All volunteers, technically, though I use that word loosely. They're prisoners, young men whose alternative was serving full sentences for draft evasion. When given the choice between our program and 5 years in federal prison, every single one chose us. That should tell you something about prison conditions. Or perhaps about their optimism. Their naivete. Phase 1 begins Monday. Sarah's hands had begun to tremble slightly. She knew she should stop reading. Should log this, call her supervisor, follow protocol. This was clearly classified material, or had been. Even decades old, even partially declassified by time and bureaucratic neglect, it should go through proper channels. But she turned another page. The entries continued, each dated, each written in that same precise hand. Dr. Reeves described his research facility, somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, never named specifically, only referenced as the site. He described his team, psychologists, physicians, a chemist named Dr. Patricia Voss whose specialty was pharmaceutical intervention in behavioral modification. Sarah felt cold despite the basement's stale warmth. April 3, 1971. Subject 7 showing promising results with the modified dosing schedule. Complete memory suppression of the conditioning sessions, but behavioral changes remain intact. Reduced aggression scores by 47%. Increased compliance by 62%. No reported side effects beyond mild disorientation and occasional headaches. Subject 12 experiencing adverse reaction. Seizures, elevated blood pressure, paranoid delusions. Dr. Voss recommends reducing the compound concentration. I'm inclined to agree. We're not trying to break them, just reshape them. Though sometimes I wonder if the distinction matters. Sarah stopped reading. She was aware of her heart beating, hard and fast. She was aware of the silence of the archive floor, the hum of the lights, the distant sound of Marcus's footsteps somewhere in the maze of shelves. She was aware that she was holding something that should not exist. Something that someone, long ago, had tried very hard to make disappear. The box number was wrong. The manifest was wrong. This journal, this evidence, had been deliberately misfiled, buried in routine correspondence from a different department, wrapped and hidden in the hope, or expectation, that no one would ever look closely enough to find it. But 48 years is a long time. Administrations change. Facilities reorganize. Documents get transferred, consolidated, forgotten. And sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, despite layers of plastic and paper and bureaucratic misdirection, the truth works its way back toward the light. Sarah Chen looked at the journal in her gloved hands and knew, with absolute certainty, that her life had just become complicated. She took a breath and turned to the next page. Chapter 2, The Unraveling. Sarah didn't go home that night. She called her ex-husband at 6:30, asked him to handle the parent-teacher conference, endured his irritated questions about why she was working late again. She didn't tell him the truth. Didn't know how to explain that she was sitting in the archives break room with a cup of vending machine coffee, reading a document that made her feel sick. The journal contained 47 entries spanning 18 months. Dr. Marcus Reeves had documented everything with clinical precision, dosages, behavioral observations, success rates. He'd noted which subjects responded well to the treatment, which ones developed complications. He'd recorded their progress with the detachment of a man charting crop yields. Except these weren't crops. They were people. June 12, 1971. Subject 23 attempted to leave the facility last night. Security stopped him at the east fence. He claimed not to remember volunteering for the program, insisted he'd been deceived. Dr. Voss administered a corrective dose. This morning he was calm, cooperative, apologetic for the confusion. Memory is such a malleable thing. Sarah photographed every page with her phone, her hands steadier now, her initial shock hardening into something else. Anger, maybe. Or purpose. The entries grew more disturbing as the months progressed. Subjects developed tremors, insomnia, personality changes. 3 had complete psychotic breaks. 1 died, subject 18, a 22-year-old from Ohio named in the margin as JM. From what Reeves described as catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage, likely unrelated to treatment protocol. Likely. October 8, 1971. Washington is pleased with our preliminary results. Senator Hirsch visited yesterday, asked pointed questions about scalability. He wants to know if our methods could be applied more broadly. Rehabilitation programs for violent offenders. Treatment for political dissidents. He didn't use that exact phrase, but the implication was clear. I told him we're still in experimental phases. I didn't tell him that half our subjects are showing long-term cognitive impairment. By midnight, Sarah had documented the entire journal. She sat in the harsh fluorescent light, staring at the last entry. December 17, 1972. The program is being terminated. Official reason, budget reallocation. Real reason, someone talked. One of the subjects, released 6 months ago, went to a reporter. Started having flashbacks, recovered memories of things we'd worked very hard to help him forget. The story hasn't broken yet, but it will. Jennings called this morning. Very calm, very clear. All records are to be destroyed. All physical evidence sanitized. The facility will be decommissioned and sold. The subjects will be paid, quietly, generously, to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Those who refuse will find themselves facing revived criminal charges. I asked him what I should do with my personal documentation. He said burn it. I probably should. But I spent 2 years of my life on this work. Controversial, yes. Ethically complex, certainly. But important. Someone should know what we learned. What we achieved. What we sacrificed. So I'm keeping this record. Hiding it somewhere it won't be found until the people involved are dead or irrelevant. Until history can judge us fairly, without the hysteria of the moment. We were trying to help, in our way. To solve problems no one else would touch. That should count for something. Sarah closed the journal. Her coffee had gone cold again. Through the break room window, she could see the first gray light of dawn creeping across the parking lot. In a few hours, the day shift would arrive. Her supervisor, Janet, would be at her desk by 8. Standard procedure would be to report this immediately, hand over the journal, let the proper authorities handle it. But Sarah kept thinking about subject 18. JM from Ohio. 22 years old. Dead from a cerebral hemorrhage that was, likely unrelated, to having his mind chemically rewritten by people who thought they were solving problems. She thought about the 30 young men who'd chosen Dr. Reeves's program over prison, not knowing what they were choosing. Who'd been paid for their silence, or threatened into it, and then scattered back into the world with damaged memories and trembling hands. Some of them might still be alive. In their 70s now, old men carrying secrets they couldn't fully remember. Or maybe they'd died young, their bodies unable to recover from what had been done to them. Sarah picked up her phone and started searching. She typed carefully, Project Hemisphere 1971 Pennsylvania. Nothing. Marcus Reeves Behavioral Modification 1970s. Nothing. They'd buried it well. But Sarah Chen had found the evidence. And she had a choice to make about what came next. Chapter 3, The Names. Sarah spent the weekend in her apartment, curtains drawn, surrounded by printed copies of the journal pages spread across her living room floor. Her daughter, Emma, was with her father. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. Every time her phone buzzed, she jumped. She'd started a spreadsheet. 30 rows, one for each subject. Most were identified only by numbers, but Reeves had occasionally slipped, noting initials or first names in the margins. J.M., Subject 18. Thomas, Subject 7. A man called Ray who was Subject 23, the one who tried to escape. On Saturday afternoon, she found something that made her hands shake so badly she had to set down her coffee. A loose page, tucked near the back of the journal, separate from the dated entries. A list. Handwritten, different from Reeves's careful script, Messier, hurried. 30 names with corresponding numbers. Full names. Dates of birth. Prison identification numbers. Someone had created a key. And then, apparently, thought better of it and hidden it with the journal. Sarah stared at the names. James Morrison, Subject 18. Born April 7, 1949. Died October 8, 1971, at 22, his brain hemorrhaging in a facility that wasn't supposed to exist. Thomas Brennan, Subject 7. Born January 12, 1948. Raymond Vasquez, Subject 23. Born August 3, 1950. These weren't experimental subjects anymore. They were people. Real people with birth certificates and families and lives that had been interrupted, altered, destroyed by a program their government had decided to forget. Sarah opened her laptop and began searching. James Morrison's obituary was brief, published in a small Ohio newspaper in October 1971. Died suddenly. Survived by parents William and Dorothy Morrison, sister Patricia. No mention of how he died. No mention of where he'd been. Thomas Brennan had lived. Sarah found him in a 2019 obituary from Pennsylvania, passed peacefully at age 71 after a long illness. Married, 3 children, worked as a warehouse supervisor. The obituary mentioned his military service, his love of fishing. Nothing about Project Hemisphere. But there was a comment section, and one comment caught her eye. Dad never talked much about his past, but he had nightmares his whole life. Hope he's finally at peace. Raymond Vasquez was harder to find. No obituary. But Sarah located a Raymond Vasquez, correct age, living in a nursing home in New Mexico. She found the facility's website, stared at the phone number for 15 minutes before her hands stopped shaking enough to dial. The receptionist was cheerful, professional. Mr. Vasquez? Yes, he's a resident here. Are you family? Sarah's mouth was dry. I'm a researcher. I'm working on a historical project about veterans programs in the early 1970s. I believe Mr. Vasquez might have participated in one. A pause. Mr. Vasquez has advanced dementia, I'm afraid. Most days he doesn't recognize his own daughter. I don't think he'd be able to help you. Does he have any family I could speak with? Anyone who might remember that period of his life? Another pause, longer this time. His daughter visits on Sundays. Maria Vasquez. I can't give out her contact information, but I could pass along yours if you'd like. Sarah left her number. Hung up. Sat in the silence of her apartment, surrounded by the names of men who'd been promised rehabilitation and given chemical lobotomies instead. Her phone rang on Sunday evening. Unknown number. This is Maria Vasquez. The nursing home said you called about my father. Sarah's heart hammered. Yes. Thank you for calling back. I know this might sound strange, but I'm an archivist, and I recently discovered documents related to a program your father might have been involved with in 1971. Project Hemisphere. Did he ever mention it? Silence stretched across the line. Then, quietly, "How do you know about that?" Sarah closed her eyes. "So it's real. He was there. My father doesn't remember much anymore. But when I was growing up, sometimes he'd have these episodes. Wake up screaming, not knowing where he was. He'd talk about doctors, about medicine that made him forget things. My mother always said it was the war, PTSD, but Dad never saw combat. He was arrested for draft evasion in 1970, and then there's just this gap. Almost 2 years where we don't know what happened to him. He came home different. Quiet. His hands shook. He couldn't hold down jobs." Maria's voice cracked. "What did they do to him?" Sarah looked at the journal pages spread across her floor. At Raymond Vasquez's name in Dr. Reeves's clinical handwriting. At the notes about corrective doses and memory suppression. "I think," she said slowly, "they tried to erase him. And when they couldn't, they buried the evidence and hoped no one would ever ask." "Can you prove it?" Sarah thought about the journal in her apartment, the document she hadn't logged, hadn't turned over to her supervisor. The evidence she'd essentially stolen from a federal facility. "Yes," she said. "I can prove it. But I'm going to need help." Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The decision to go public took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, consultations with lawyers Sarah couldn't afford, encrypted emails with a journalist from the Washington Post named David Kramer who'd spent his career investigating government malfeasance. 3 weeks of Sarah watching her back in the parking lot, jumping at shadows, wondering if she was being paranoid or appropriately cautious. Maria Vasquez became her ally. Together, they tracked down 6 more survivors. 6 men in their 70s, scattered across the country, living quiet lives marked by unexplained tremors, memory gaps, and nightmares they couldn't articulate. 1 had committed suicide in 1989. 2 refused to talk, their silence purchased decades ago with settlement money and veiled threats. But 4 agreed to tell their stories. Thomas Brennan's daughter provided medical records, pages of neurological assessments, prescriptions for seizure medications, psychiatric evaluations noting trauma of unknown origin. Raymond Vasquez, in a brief moment of clarity during Maria's visit, had held her hand and whispered, "They took something from me. I never got it back." David Kramer was meticulous. He verified everything, cross-referenced the journal entries with budget documents Sarah helped him request through FOIA, found gaps in government spending reports from 1971 to 1972, traced the sale of a facility in rural Pennsylvania that had been purchased by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1970 and sold to a private company in 1973 for a fraction of its value. The facility was now a storage warehouse. Sarah and David drove there on a cold February morning. The building was concrete and windowless, surrounded by chain-link fence. Nothing remained of Project Hemisphere except the architecture of secrets, rooms that had once held hospital beds and observation equipment, now filled with pallets of consumer goods. Sarah stood in the parking lot, wind cutting through her coat, and imagined 30 young men locked inside those walls, their minds being dismantled and rebuilt by people who thought they were serving the greater good. The story broke on March 15, 50 years, almost to the day, after Dr. Marcus Reeves wrote his first journal entry. The headline, Project Hemisphere, declassified documents reveal secret government program that experimented on prisoners. Sarah's phone didn't stop ringing. Her supervisor called, furious about proper protocol. Federal investigators called, asking how she'd obtained classified materials. News outlets called, wanting interviews. Her ex-husband called, angry that Emma was hearing things at school about her mother being on the news. But other calls came too. From families who'd lost sons in the early 1970s and never knew why. From former government employees who'd heard whispers about behavioral modification programs and been told to forget what they'd heard. From historians and ethicists and victims advocates who wanted to help, to document, to ensure this particular chapter of American history couldn't be buried again. Dr. Marcus Reeves was dead. Had been for 12 years, died peacefully in his sleep at 83, his obituary describing him as a pioneering psychologist who'd dedicated his career to public service. Senator Hirsch, the one who'd asked about scalability, had died in 2003. Dr. Patricia Voss was alive, 91 years old, living in a retirement community in Arizona. She refused all interview requests, issued a statement through her lawyer, "I have no comment on allegations regarding projects I may or may not have been involved with over 50 years ago." The Department of Justice announced an investigation. Predictably, slowly, bureaucratically. Senators gave speeches about accountability and the sanctity of human rights. A few called it ancient history, a distraction from current issues. But the survivors had names now. Faces. Families who could finally understand why their fathers and husbands had come home broken. Sarah sat in a congressional hearing room 6 months after finding the journal, sworn in, her testimony recorded for the official record. She described opening box 2897, finding the journal wrapped in plastic, making the decision to document what she'd found. A senator from Ohio, whose district included James Morrison's hometown, asked her a question. "Dr. Chen, you violated federal protocol by not immediately reporting this discovery. You essentially stole classified documents. Why?" Sarah looked at the gallery behind him. Maria Vasquez sat in the front row, her father's photograph clutched in her hands. Beside her, Thomas Brennan's daughter. And behind them, reporters, advocates, citizens who'd come to witness accountability. Because, Sarah said quietly, someone had to care more about the truth than the rules. These men were buried once. I wasn't going to let them be buried twice. The hearing room was silent. Then someone in the gallery began to applaud. Chapter 5, What Remains. The official apology came 14 months after the story broke. A statement from the Attorney General, read at a press conference on a Friday afternoon in June, carefully worded by lawyers who'd spent weeks debating every phrase. The United States government acknowledges that Project Hemisphere violated the ethical standards we hold ourselves to today. While the individuals involved believed they were acting in the national interest during a tumultuous period in our history, their methods were unacceptable. We extend our deepest apologies to the survivors and families affected by this program. No admission of criminal wrongdoing. No mention of prosecution. Most of the people responsible were dead, and the living ones were protected by statutes of limitation and legal complexities that made accountability nearly impossible. But there was money. A compensation fund, established by congressional appropriation. $50 million divided among verified survivors and the families of deceased participants. Not enough to undo the damage, but something. An acknowledgement that harm had been done. Sarah watched the press conference from her new apartment in Baltimore. She'd left the Federal Record Center, not quite fired but strongly encouraged to resign. The official letter cited serious breaches of protocol. Unofficially, her supervisor had told her she'd become too controversial, that her presence made people uncomfortable. She'd found work at a university archive, lower pay but better hours. Emma adjusted to the move better than Sarah expected. Her daughter was 13 now, old enough to understand, at least partially, what her mother had done and why. "Are you glad you found it?" Emma asked one evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Sarah made dinner. Sarah thought about the question. About the sleepless nights, the legal bills, the end of her career at the federal level. About Raymond Vasquez, who died 3 months after the story broke, his dementia too advanced for him to understand that his silence had finally been broken. About Thomas Brennan's daughter, who'd wept when she learned her father's nightmares had a name, a cause, a history. "Yes," Sarah said. "I'm glad." The journal itself was now in the National Archives, properly catalogued, available to researchers. Sarah had visited once, submitted a request to view it, sat in the reading room with the leather-bound book under museum lighting. Someone had added a notation to the finding aid, donor, Dr. Sarah Chen. Acquisition date, March 2023. Provenance, recovered from misfiled records, Box 2897, Federal Records Center, College Park, Maryland. It felt strange to see her name attached to it. As though she'd created this history rather than simply found it. David Kramer won a Pulitzer for his coverage. He thanked Sarah in his acceptance speech, called her a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. The quote made her uncomfortable. She didn't think of herself as brave or principled. She'd just been unable to look away. Maria Vasquez stayed in touch. They spoke every few weeks, conversations that ranged from practical matters, the compensation fund paperwork, congressional testimony schedules, to more personal territory. Maria was writing a book about her father, trying to reconstruct the man he'd been before Project Hemisphere, the man he might have become without it. "I found a letter he wrote to my mother in 1970, Maria told Sarah during one call. Before his arrest, before everything. He was scared about the draft, but he was also hopeful. Talked about wanting to teach history, about the kids they'd have someday. He was 20 years old and full of plans." Sarah heard the catch in Maria's voice. "They didn't just experiment on him," Maria continued. "They stole his future. Every version of himself he might have been. That was the truth the official apologies couldn't capture. The compensation couldn't restore. That 30 young men had walked into a facility in Pennsylvania with their lives ahead of them and come out as different people, diminished, damaged, haunted by gaps in their own memories." Some nights, Sarah still dreamed about Box 2897. About opening it and finding nothing inside, just empty space. About the journal dissolving in her hands like ash. About arriving at work to find the whole archive gone, vanished, as though it had never existed. She'd wake up gasping, reach for her phone, pull up the photos she'd taken that first night. Proof that it had been real. That she hadn't imagined it. The last page of Dr. Reeves's journal haunted her most. His conviction that history would judge him fairly, that future generations would understand the necessity of what he'd done. His belief that someone should know about his work, his sacrifices, his achievements. He'd been right about one thing: someone should know. But Sarah suspected the judgment he'd anticipated wasn't the one history would deliver. On the anniversary of finding the journal, Sarah returned to College Park. The Federal Records Center looked the same: squat concrete building, endless rows of shelving, fluorescent lights humming overhead. She didn't go inside. Just stood in the parking lot, watching archivists come and go, carrying tablets and box cutters and coffee cups. Somewhere in that building were thousands more boxes. Millions of documents. How many other secrets were buried there, waiting for someone to look closely enough? How many other wrongs, carefully misfiled, wrapped in plastic and buried under layers of bureaucratic misdirection? Sarah couldn't open every box. Couldn't right every wrong. But she'd opened one. And 30 names that had been erased now existed in the historical record. 30 men who'd been treated as experimental subjects were now remembered as human beings. It wasn't justice, exactly. Justice would have been preventing Project Hemisphere entirely. Would have been consequences for the people who'd authorized it, conducted it, covered it up. But it was something. A crack in the wall of official silence. Light reaching into a place that had been dark for 50 years. Sarah got back in her car and drove home to Baltimore, to her daughter and her new job and her ordinary life. The journal remained in the archive, preserved and catalogued, available to anyone who wanted to know the truth. They'd buried the evidence. But not deep enough. And sometimes, that made all the difference.